Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are going to be sharing some best practices for taking an online bar exam. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We are here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox Podcast. Today we're talking about best practices for preparing for an online bar exam, based on the 2 virtual exams that have now been given. Well, first up, jurisdictions are going to have the option to have online or in-person exams in July, so obviously you need to check on which one you personally are going to be taking. I mean, at this point, I think we're guessing most of them will still be online. Well, and the good news here is that the online exams haven't actually been as horrible, I think, as most people expected. They obviously haven't been perfect, but overall they seem to have gone fairly well. And the pass rates from at least the October 2020 exam were generally quite high. Were you surprised by this, Lee?
I kind of was. I mean, when we really dug into it and talked about, having some extra time to study, maybe some people dropping out of sitting for the test if they didn't feel like it was going well, if it was too stressful. But I was pleasantly surprised that the pass rates were pretty good. And I think that there are definitely some positives to this online experience. I think for a lot of people, not having to go sit in that room with sometimes thousands of people.
Ugh, so horrible.
It can be really, amp up the stress. And so it's just less stressful. You get to control your experience a lot better. You really get to practice under exam conditions because you're living in your exam conditions.
Right. You're literally doing these same exam conditions that you've hopefully practiced in the same place, in the same way. So, I mean, particularly for people who have any sort of test anxiety, I think that can be a huge factor.
Yeah. So I definitely think for a lot of people that is a benefit. I also think that this generation of bar takers, many of them have taken a lot of computerized exams, either at school or maybe even the GRE where you take it at a testing center, but it's still kind of on a computer. I think this isn't a totally foreign experience, I think, to this generation of bar takers, which I also think, may ease this transition a bit. I personally also like the fact that you have to break up the exam and you get these forced breaks where you can have snacks, you can go to the bathroom. I almost said go to the potty because I've been spending a lot of time with my children recently. And I always will say, do you need to go to the potty? Yeah. So you can take a break and go to the potty and then you can get some water. And I think that for a lot of people, that also helps them, adhere to the time differences between the different pieces of the test, but also to kind of shake off a bad essay or bad section and kind of regroup.
Right. In places like California, certainly, it also prevents you from borrowing time from other essays. Mm-hmm. So I think even though people sometimes think that's a good strategy for them, frankly, it rarely is. So it really forces you just to have that 1 hour. Obviously, that's not the case in other places. But, I think in California, at least, it really does give you that focus of one essay, 1 hour. And like you said, if things maybe didn't go so well, at least you get a break mentally, physically. You can go do some jumping jacks, cry into your pillow for a few minutes and then do some deep breathing and come back and do the next essay.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, that's a huge help. I would also guess that anyone who has any sort of attention deficit issues, whether they're, to the extent that they get accommodations or not, also, breaking this up into more manageable chunks does really just allow you to use your coping mechanisms, like you were saying, the jumping jacks, the deep breaths, whatever it may be. One of the things that we often hear from students is they have coping mechanisms, but they never want to borrow time to do them. And
right.
So this allows them to kind of, not feel like they're taking anything away from the exam situation.
Right. So, I think it's not all negative if someone's listening to this and they're really dreading the online experience. I think it probably for a lot of ways is not the worst thing ever. But I mean, there are things that people obviously don't like about it. And I think those are worth considering.
Yeah. I mean, the big one for me is I really don't like not being able to mark up questions or make notes on the question. I think that's how I've always done it. And now I feel really like old being like, that's how it's always been. I don't want it to be different. But that's how we have taken exams even when we've written answers on the computer. Usually we have some sort of printed paper. I think that's been hard for me to practice without, when we're working on creating materials for students without having hard copies. And that's been shocking to me how attached I am to that habit. If I was studying for the bar, I would have to be very disciplined to make myself do all of my practice without having those hard copies so I can create new habits.
Yeah, I think that for me is obviously the hardest thing too, particularly on something like the performance test where you're used to highlighting stuff and making notes, and even on essays, when we were previously instructing students, it was always like, use your scratch paper outline and make sure that you're not putting it on your computer, because what if your computer dies? Well, now you have to do that. But that's just the test you're taking. And I think, we'll talk later about ways to cope with some of these things. But I completely hear you on like, it will be hard for a lot of people to force themselves to do this in the new format because it's harder. It's easier to print them out, but ultimately that's not the test you're taking.
Yeah, and I really think people need to frame this as creating new habits. If it's hard for you, then you almost have to be more strict to create a new habit. You've really got to be disciplined with yourself. And I think that's hard, especially in this arena of where many things are hard. So it's always hard to do something else hard. But you've got to let go of that old habit, that old process to give this a really good shot. Nobody's going to care if you don't pass, that you didn't pass because you couldn't mark up the question. Like, that's not going to fly. People just want to know if you passed or failed.
Yeah, they're like, well, too bad. Maybe you should have practiced more not using your marked up questions.
Right.
I think there are other practical things that people don't necessarily love. You can't take a break when you want to, which is an issue. You can't have water, you can't get up and stretch, you can't do all of these things. I mean,
no potty breaks. No potty breaks.
Right. And, I'm one of those people on the airplane who has to have the aisle seat because I'm up and down like multiple times in a flight. And so this would be hard for me. But, again, like it's just something that you've got to deal with.
Yeah. We heard from a lot of folks that the stress of the camera and knowing that they're being recorded got in their head a little bit, that they were worried if they were going to look suspicious, if they were looking off into the distance to think. And then, if you are on any bar exam Facebook groups or, any sort of message boards, you would have heard about places like California sending out all of these letters claiming that people may have been in violation, that sent everybody through the roof, and then telling people that just kidding, some of them weren't in violation.
Well, it was something crazy. It was like a third of the people who sat in October. It's like, okay, obviously a third of the people who sat for the October exam were not trying to cheat. I mean, sure, maybe a few of those people were, not a third of the people.
Not a third. But I think that a lot of people let the camera get into their head and the fact that they were being recorded. I think what a lot of people don't really understand is they're using artificial intelligence, and it's not like there's like a person watching you on the other side.
Right. But it feels very like panopticon, and that's the idea of it, is that someone could be watching you. And, we heard from people who had their laptop cameras just happened to be positioned in a strange place on the laptop, and that caused issues. There are all these things that can kind of get in people's heads. I talked to someone recently who's like, I wasted time on the performance test, like showing them each side of my piece of paper because I was so paranoid that they were going to think I was cheating. There is all this stuff.
Yeah. And the more of these tests that are done, the clearer a lot of these requirements get, and they'll hopefully get better at the testing software. I believe there are lawsuits going on around the country, but at least in California, that they are saying that the facial recording software is discriminatory or is flagging certain classes of people over other classes of people. So there's just a lot still going on because this is kind of the wild, wild west of exams to do them in this way.
Right. And also I think there are issues with just the facial recognition in general, and that tends to be very racially based. Certain people are having a lot more trouble than other types of people with their IDs being recognized and all these kind of things. And these are real problems. And, hopefully they are going to be sorted out. And I think there are lawsuits basically saying like you can't use this type of technology. Whether those will move forward by July, I tend to doubt, but you never know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you never know. I mean, a lot of times this technology is, I don't know. I always think about voice recognition and how
it's so bad, particularly for women.
It's so bad. It's so bad. And I just always compare this stuff to voice recognition. And I'm like, if my computer can't understand very simple words, like call dad or whatever I might say, I can't believe that the software is able to do what it's claiming to do. But well, apparently it's not doing some of it particularly well. If it can't recognize like a man with a dark facial beard, I think was one of the examples of the facial recognition having issues because a man had facial hair. That's a problem.
Yeah, that's kind of a common thing. Well, it's the same thing. I mean, it's a well-known, issue that basically the voice recognition is way better for male voices than female voices. I wonder why that is. These are algorithms that people built, and unfortunately they have artifacts of the way that people think.
Yep. Yeah. So,
but that's probably a different podcast.
Probably a different podcast. I did have a friend once whose job was to listen to Siri kind of commands and judge whether or not they worked. Yeah, but then apparently people get really violent with the Siri. And they said that they thought part of it was that it's typically a female voice, but they would yell and swear at Siri and that it was a little intense sometimes.
Yeah, I think people have a lot of aggression and they just take it out in very strange places, like on inanimate objects in their phone that are talking to them.
It's not a real person.
Yeah.
And then I realized that there were people like my friend who were listening to the Siri conversations, and I turned Siri off.
Oh, yeah. No, I turned that off a long time ago because I'm like, this is just weird. You don't need to be listening to me. Like, I'll just set my alarm on my own. Thanks.
I know. Exactly. But I digress. Okay. I think one of the big things is, what do you do if you have computer issues?
Yeah, this is a huge problem.
You're there by yourself. There's some spinning circle of death on your computer screen, or something's not uploading correctly, and there is no one there. There's no proctor to wave down. There's nothing.
Yeah, and you also don't have your phone because it's in a different room. So I think people were really stressed about this the first time around. It doesn't, again, seem to have been a huge issue, but it is definitely one of those things you want to understand the process for before you take the exam. Like, what do I do if this happens? And then be able to execute on that.
Yeah. So again, a little tricky. I think, I haven't heard as often about systems just crashing like they used to even 10 years ago with this software. Right. I think it was much more common. But you never know. Stuff still does happen. Crazy stories still happen. Computers still melt down. I think the one thing about the electronic exam is they are at least making people do these mock exams and submit them. And maybe there's just a tiny bit more testing going on, like user testing, to make sure that the software works, because they're being pretty strict on that requirement.
Right. And you should definitely, if you're taking this exam, take advantage of any opportunity to practice, because some of this, frankly, is user error. And if you're not pushing the right buttons in the right sequence because you're really stressed out, then you may have problems. So you just want to make sure that you've practiced this until it's completely, as you said, a habit. You know exactly how to log in. You know exactly what you need to do. You know how everything works so that it's not something you're thinking about.
And one thing that caused a lot of anxiety, I think, especially for the October exam, was what these screens were going to look like.
Right.
What was what windows were going to be where, what could you highlight, which could you not. And we now pretty much have that information unless they change something again. And who knows, not putting it past anybody. It's possible. But now that we know, when you think about starting to sit down and study again, you can basically mimic what they're doing, just using Word and a PDF of the performance test or whatever it might be, and really get comfortable with what the screen looks like. And I think that that's going to help a lot of people because, there was just a lot of uncertainty of feeling about what they were actually going to have to do in the room. And we now know that. So you can make it feel very ordinary by exam day, which I think is important.
Yeah, in the beginning, it was like, are you going to be able to copy or paste or not? And going back and forth. And then people uncovered secret ways to do it. All that stuff hopefully has been sort of worked out. And you can just say okay, from the start of my study time, this is what I can be expecting. Yeah. And as you said, hopefully that doesn't shift right before the exam, but who knows?
Who knows these days? It's just hard to know.
But fingers crossed.
Exactly. I think accommodation issues can be a bit tricky and complex as well, depending on what you're asking for. Some people with certain accommodations, I still believe, had the option to take it in person. Maybe I'm making that up, but I think that some folks, for the accommodations they needed, had to take that option. But if we always recommend you got to file for accommodations early. You got to work this stuff out with the bar as early as possible. I think these virtual exams, depending on what you're trying to get, just encourage you to do that. Even be more diligent a little bit earlier, because if what you're asking for doesn't jive with the at-home model, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get it. It just means that you've got to figure out how they're going to be able to accommodate you.
Right. And I think definitely, I did not get the sense that people's individual accommodations were necessarily the highest priority of the bar associations when they were the board of examiners, when they were trying to sort all this other stuff out. So definitely we've heard stories of like a lot of delays, like weeks before the exam, people not really knowing how they were going to be taking it. So definitely apply early and keep following up, because you want to understand exactly what you're getting into.
Yeah. So we've kind of been touching on it as we've been discussing the pros and cons of the electronic exam, but what do we think are some of the things that people should do differently to prepare versus the typical in-person exam? We've already talked about you need to practice this stuff online. Do you think that there's any value to doing it the old school way? Is there any value to doing MBE questions on paper or printing essay and PTs? Or are we just totally out of that realm right now?
Well, I would say for the MBE, I would not do any really. I mean, if you've run out of online questions and you're doing some from a book, that's fine. Or if you're doing some from a book because you don't understand anything about how the MBE works and you don't know any of the law, I mean, hopefully that happens before you start really studying for the bar. I mean, I think by the time you jump into the serious bar prep, say 8 to 10 weeks before the exam, I would say for the MBE, you do them exclusively online. What do you think?
I think so too. And that being said, I hate online MBE questions. I mean, I always have. So this is speaking from a perspective of I would love to give you any other option, because that would not be my preference. But the reality is, the more you don't like it, the more you have to do it.
Yeah, see, I'm the opposite. I did the online version. There was an online computer version way back in the day. This was even pre-Adaptibar, and I thought it was great. So I just sit in a cafe with my laptop and do a bunch of MBE questions. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't see any real reason to be doing MBE questions on paper, particularly if you really want to.
Yeah, I really feel like the more you want to do it, the less you can do it. I think you have to make yourself do it on the computer. And one of the reasons that I think this is so critical is we've worked with students who've found that this electronic format is really causing some issues of trouble reading slowly enough, skipping over words. I think one of the tough things about reading on the computer is we're kind of trained to read quickly on the laptop, to skim. And you can't do that on an exam without poor results. And so one of the things that you also have to retrain your brain is how you're going to slow down and read every word. I mean, I even saw myself do this the other week. A friend sent me an email about a big job career change. And then I kind of got it. And then I skimmed it to get the highlights. And then I actually shut the email. And then I realized I really didn't even understand fully what they were talking about. So I went back and I sat down and was read the whole email. And it was a very thoughtfully written email. And it was just such a highlight for me of how skimmable we have really started treating technology, and that can be a problem. And it's something you have to really untrain your brain to do, to be deliberate, or you're going to miss a lot of points. So there are things you can do. We talked with this student about, almost mouthing the words, so they're reading it out loud to themselves, going really line by line, maybe even using their finger to draw on the computer screen. Anything that could be allowed within the parameters of the testing software, but you've got to be creative to break some of these habits.
I think that's a great point. And yeah, one thing we definitely have seen with certain students is they're rushing through MBE questions on the screen in a way that they would not necessarily be doing on paper. So that's one of those where if you recognize that, you get to the end of a set and you've been spending, say, a minute on each question, that's probably not long enough. So, you've got to sort of be very deliberate in your practice about setting a timer or something like that to really train yourself to spend the time that you need to spend on each question.
Yeah, noting that in the exam room, you're not going to be able to set like a timer, for 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 33 seconds or whatever it might be. But you could definitely do that in practice.
Right.
If you're, with your phone, just to train yourself what that time feels like.
Right. So it's a habit.
Because I think it's a habit. And we actually have a pretty good memory of time and what, approximate time feels like if we practice it a lot. So you just have to be very, very deliberate. One of the things I did when I was in college is I was an intern at E! Television, and I helped produce voiceover ads for their TV shows. And there was a guy who did his voiceover stuff, and he could literally trim like seconds off of something. Like they did it, he'd do the voiceover and they're like, we need you to trim off 3 seconds. And then the next time he would trim off 3 seconds. It was magical. It was so impressive. But it just was such an important lesson that if we really focus on timing, we can learn what that time feels like and implement it.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, we get good at anything we practice. I can definitely pour out 100 grams of flour or water right now without a whole lot of trouble.
Yeah. What is it, the Malcolm Gladwell's, is it from Outliers? Is it 10,000 hours or something to master? I mean, when you really think about like how much time it takes to master something, if you just start to chip away at that, you're going to get closer. Even though you may not feel like you're an MBE master, you're going to be a whole lot closer if you're deliberate about it and practice it over and over again.
Agreed. So what do you think about the essays and the PTs? Do you think there's any value in people starting with actual paper there?
I wish there was. I just don't think. Again, this is like my wants and needs versus like reality. Like my person who wants the comfort of the actual paper, wants to come up with some reason why you should still do it on paper, but that is not what the test looks like anymore. At least until it may go back to an in-person exam, and until it gets there, you've got to do it all on the screen. Because again, if you are having trouble doing it on the screen, doing it on paper is not going to get you closer to your goals.
No, that's true. It's just going to make you basically like anxious about the fact that you would be doing better if you did it on paper.
Yeah. Also, I think let's say you're studying long term. Let's say you're listening to this and you've decided you're not going to take the July exam, you're going to take February, and maybe February is going to be in person. We don't know that yet. So we're not going to. I mean, almost exactly a year ago, we started having these COVID podcasts where we had no idea what was going on. I'm definitely not going to assume I know what's going to happen next February. But I think it would be always easier to move from 100% computer practice to paper practice.
Sure.
Having paper. So you might as well just study on the computer, because if you end up taking an exam where you do have more scratch paper, where you have things you can mark up, I just think that's easier for most people. So it's not like, I don't know, it's not like you're setting yourself up for failure if you end up taking the exam in person.
No, that's a good point. I mean, there's really no downside. I'm like, of course it'll be in person next February, but you're right. We would not have predicted this a year ago. So,
oh my gosh. For some reason, now we're recording this at like the end of February, and we're starting to hit these like milestones of it being a year. Like at my son's school, they do these spring baskets where they plant grass in a basket.
Yeah.
To watch it grow. It's really cute. Anyway, I vividly remember taking the baskets last year. And then there was all this drama about getting the baskets back because the kids were upset because the schools, we stopped going to school. What was going to happen to the baskets? Who were watering the baskets? Like it was a big deal. And so then I get this email from the school that's like, you need to bring the basket. And I totally had like this like visceral emotional response that was like, the baskets? The baskets are back? How is it possible that it's time to bring the baskets back? And it is. And that's creepy to me. So I just feel like that who knows about next year, because I'm still having a hard time fathoming that it was a year ago that schools shut down.
True. Yeah, very true. Oh, well. Yeah. So anyway.
PTSD from the spring baskets at my kids' school.
Yeah, no, it is that weird time where you're like, oh yeah, this was like the memory of the last party I went to for an entire year for my nephew's birthday. It's like, oh, his next birthday is in a few days.
I know. Well, a year ago last week, we were skiing together with my kid.
Wow, that's crazy. Probably should have been doing that. We didn't know.
We didn't know. Oh, man. Gosh. Yeah. I can't wait till this is memories that we talk about.
We'll all laugh about it one day.
Well, someday. Yeah. So I think that the reality is you got to do it on the computer. I think that for performance test questions, one of the things you really want to make sure that you understand when you start studying is if you have access to scratch paper, physical scratch paper for the performance test. And if you do, then you should study the way that your jurisdiction lays it out.
Right.
And, you know, if you have scratch paper, I think that for most people is all the better. If you don't, then you've got to figure out how to do it on the computer. Again, it's brutal, but you still have to do it.
Absolutely. I think the PT is harder for most people just because it's longer. So, again, I think you've got to be doing this for the actual test you're taking. It is definitely a strong temptation to say, well, I just need to do some and figure it out, and then I'll switch to online and maybe do one. I mean, if you've never seen one before, fine, print one out. But I really wouldn't do much more than that because you've got to be practicing in the format that you're actually going to be using.
Yeah. I think that especially if you've taken this exam before in person where you have the physical packet, the ability to flip through the pages with ease or earmark things. I personally mark up the file in the library a lot on the page. So if I was sitting to take the exam electronically, I would really need to relearn ways to track that information. How am I going to make notations on my electronic scratch paper or my physical scratch paper so I can find this information again? What does the screen look like? Does it give me page numbers? What am I going to do to organize the information so I can still find it? I'm going to have to relearn that. And I don't think that there's a perfect way to do it, but you just have to be able to practice it enough so you can problem solve.
Right. And I think also really sitting down and sort of thinking through the problem and how it makes sense to you to solve that problem is what you need to do. What makes sense to me may not make sense to you, but we all need to have some sort of strategy that we've thought about and a process that we practice so that in the moment, you can always revert back to that instead of kind of panicking and blanking and just being like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. So the only way that I think printing something out could be possibly helpful is actually self-evaluating your work, which may sound crazy, but when you realize that the graders are, I believe, still evaluating this stuff on paper, and I think most of us proofread a little slower and better on paper, if you're trying to mimic giving yourself feedback like a grader would, or hopefully better than a grader would, because I hope you spend more time on it than a grader would. I could see printing it out and marking up your answer to give yourself feedback. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. So if you want to just be self-indulgent and go ahead and print something out in that way, especially if you're struggling reading things carefully online, it could be a way that you can, give yourself a little boost and read it in another way.
I think that's a good idea. And I can even see after you've done the problem and you are self-evaluating it, and maybe say, for example, you see that you missed an issue. At that point, I might print out the question and literally read it carefully and look at what you missed and try to figure out, why did I miss this on the screen? Would I have seen this in the paper? And sort of use that as a learning process.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One of the things that we have for MBE questions that we use with our tutoring students is kind of a grid where people track what they've done wrong or why they're missing questions, why they're getting them right. And I think that when you're going back and evaluating your work, one of the things that maybe you didn't always ask yourself before that you need to start asking yourself is, did I miss this question because I didn't read it slowly enough? Did I miss facts? I think you need to make sure that this computer experience isn't the reason why you're not performing at your best. And you're going to have to, be constantly evaluating that for yourself, especially the more tired and burned out you get, because I think that's when we get sloppier about almost everything.
Right. And if I remember correctly, I think Adaptor actually does track your average time spent on questions and things. So you could theoretically see that that is below where it needs to be. And that might be something to consider. Yep.
So I don't think that the skill set is any different.
Right.
I think that part is the same. It is just the execution. And I think when we all get stressed, we tend to kind of hunker down and go into our corners and say, but I want to do it this way because this is the way I like to do it. And the test isn't the way that I like to do it. And I'm sorry, but it is what it is. It's not that different. You're going to have to just take it anyway.
Yeah, this is the test you're taking. Sorry.
This is the test you're taking. It's not an easy transition. You're you have to resist the temptation to be self-indulgent and make yourself feel better in the moment, because we're playing a long game here. And 20 years from now, nobody's going to ask you if you took the paper exam or the online exam. They're just going to ask you, if you're licensed.
Right.
Probably at that point, they won't even ask you anymore. They'll just assume you are.
Right, because you probably wouldn't have been practicing.
hopefully
you haven't been lying this whole time.
Yeah. Did I mention I've been talking to my kids a lot about poop? I'm just not quite on my game like I used to.
Yeah, but I think honestly, I think a lot of this is sort of the mental game too. Can people kind of put aside that frustration and, that frankly, the self-sabotage of like, well, I would be doing so much better if this were the case. It's like, well, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of wanting things to be different instead of being in the moment, and I think that's something we've all had to really practice during COVID, right? Exactly. That things are not what we want them to be, but things are as they are, and we've got to do with what we got.
Right. I think, your goal is just to get enough points to pass this particular exam, and whatever needs to happen to do that is what needs to happen. And maybe it's not fair and maybe you don't like it, but that, if you want to take the exam, you may as well try to pass it. So you may as well practice in the format you're going to be using.
Yep, exactly. And then the closer you get to the test, then I think you just need to start mimicking whatever's the schedule for the test. So
yeah, exactly.
It starts at 8:30, sit at 8:30, do a question. Like, there's no reason why you shouldn't be at least spending half of your day executing different parts of the test as practice. And just get so used to it. Once you get used to it, it's just not going to faze you. But these are the things you have control over. So getting used to the way that they give the test is something that has nothing to do with how much law you know. So you might as well figure that part out and not let it, hinder your performance.
Yeah, and I think this is where your creature comforts come in, where you do really need to practice. Say you do have to sit for 90 minutes. How much caffeine can you take in, or how much water can you drink beforehand to be able to comfortably sit for 90 minutes? That's something that you should know the answer to with absolute clarity before you take the test.
No, it's true. And, this is still just a test, and not letting it become something else just because they've changed it up on you. I think that the mental game here is a lot. The world is still a lot. I think it's more a lot than it was last year at this time. I'm not even sure, because we're all so fatigued.
I don't know. I think if you listen to our original podcast on this topic, you'd be like, wow, those people were really freaking out.
Well, we were pretty shell-shocked. I remember there was no school. I was like, we had no idea what was going on. That was kooky. So yes, we have settled into this reality, but I do think that both the COVID fatigue and this change of life, where a lot of us have lost a lot of the things that we do that feed our souls, that make us feel connected, that make us feel better. It just allows these stumbling blocks to feel so much bigger. I think especially around technology, because we're all so tired of technology in a lot of ways. I prefer not to have all of my social gatherings on Zoom or things like that. But you've just got to not let that stuff hinder your performance. You got to figure out how to separate it.
Right.
And make peace with the fact that this is the world that we are in. This is the life you are living. And if you can knock this out during this time, then all the better.
Right. You'll just be done with it. Yeah. And I think, one thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that you're breaking up computer time with other things during your study day, so that you're not literally just sitting at a computer for the entire day. So things like working in movement, specific time that you're going to recharge. I think that stuff is so critical, because you can just get kind of in this fog or this haze by sitting in front of a screen all day long. It's not great for your body. It's not great for your brain. And so I think that's just something to be cognizant of in a time where maybe you don't have any real reason to leave the house.
It's true. And I know you and I both wear Apple Watches, and I'm not like a super step counter, but I have noticed that during these COVID times, it is so much easier to realize that you're not moving your body, because I used to run a lot of errands.
Right.
I used to go do stuff.
You used to leave the house for things.
I used to leave the house. I used to park in a large parking lot, walk into a store. I used to go up and down all the aisles of the grocery store. I don't do any of those things anymore. And so sometimes I'm kind of shocked that I haven't taken that many steps. And then I have an exercise bike, and I'll ride the bike or whatever. But it'll still surprise me how little I've been walking.
Yeah, you're like 2,000 steps. That's not very many.
It's not very many. So I think that that's one of the things that if you've never tracked some of that movement, or if you're having a hard time gauging what's normal, because our normal has been so kind of knocked off kilter, it could be a good opportunity to track some of that movement to keep yourself honest.
Right. And you don't have to have an Apple Watch. You can just set a timer. You study for 50 minutes. You get up and you walk around, even if it's just walking around the house. So, I mean, I would prefer walking around the block, getting outside, getting some fresh air for 10 minutes, and then you come back. You know, that's completely low cost way to do this.
Yep, exactly. So you got to like work it in though, because it doesn't serve you to have like a cracking body that doesn't feel good. And, you know.
Yeah, and that definitely will happen if you're studying, you know, all day, every day with like crappy ergonomics. I mean, these are things to think about.
Yeah. Another thing you want to think about is just planning ahead for any computer issues or accommodations that you need. Again, we talked about it earlier. Just apply early. Everything is taking longer in COVID days, but just plan ahead. Don't leave things till the last minute. Don't replace your computer at the last minute. Like, do everything early.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think just allow extra time and recognize things are not going to move as fast as they might have.
Yeah. Well, as we're running out of time, any final thoughts?
I mean, I think people just ideally can try to keep this in perspective. Like, yes, in certain ways, having to take the exam online is more challenging. But as we talked about earlier, there are potential upsides. And remember, the pass rates for the first online exams ever were actually very high in most states. So this is possible. Yeah. People are going to pass, and hopefully you can be one of those people.
Yep. Yeah, it's still just a test. Just study for it, prep for it. It just feels a little different if you've taken it before, but I don't think that there's a huge downside to it. Plenty of people are being successful in this format, and you can too.
Exactly.
All right, well, with that, we're out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.